Welcome to Future Conversations, the podcast that explores research through the lens of tomorrow by Monash University, Malaysia.
Welcome to the podcast that is rooted in research shaping the future through conversations today. I am Dr Cyren Wong, an ecologist and head of School of Pathways and Immersion at Monash University, Malaysia, and in this episode, we celebrate World Firefly Day. In the heart of Malaysia's damp riverbanks and moonlit forests, a tiny light flickered back into life, a species of firefly unseen for over a century. Today, we speak with Dr. Faridah Akmal Jusoh, the biologist behind this rediscovery, and Law Yao Hua, an entomologist turned environmental journalist and co-founder of Macaranga, about the power of storytelling, scientific curiosity, and why even the smallest spark deserves a voice. As we approach World Firefly Day, let's explore what it means to be a voice for the voiceless and how charisma in conservation starts with care, curiosity, and community. Hi, Dr. Wan, and hi, Yao Hua. Dr. Wan, could you walk us through the moment you realized that you had rediscovered this firefly species?
Well, I think the first word I would say is humble. I feel humble because back in 2014, I got a chance to actually check out the original specimen, what we call it type specimen, at the Natural History Museum, London, where it was first described based on a single specimen from Gombak Valley, 1921, and that is called or named after the place, and it was named Pteroptyx gombakia. And then years later, we found another second specimen, also a single specimen from museum collection at the Museum of Zoology, University Malaya. But the thing is, we never actually see them, like a live sighting of this species. So we always thought that, it's a single specimen, it's always a museum specimen, we don't even know what the habitat is. So when we've got to know, and we found it's actually in the heart of Kuala Lumpur, or in Bukit Kiara. So it's actually, I would say, a good surprise, but at the same time, also a bit concerned about what's going to happen on the population of this species.
And can I also ask, when you found these specimens, when you went to these museums to look at these specimens, were you specifically looking for this species of firefly, or was it just a thing that you happened to come across?
So I was there as a taxonomist. At that time, my colleague actually was looking at revision of fireflies in Southeast Asia. And I was at the time revising all species under this group, Pteroptyx. And when I was in London, it happened to be there's one specific species that hasn't been described before. It was collected in 1921. And then that's when I was there to collect. And then it has a really interesting feature of this species that you cannot really see this feature in other Pteroptyx, or what we call it band-winged firefly group. And it has a lobe arising along the margin of the light organ. So this is a specific feature that only Pteroptyx gombakia has it.
Wow. And Yao Hua, so Macaranga has featured some coverage of, Dr. Wan's rediscovery. From your perspective, as someone who is, I guess, familiar with the scientific significance of this, but also as a storyteller, what does a rediscovery like this mean, you think, to the broader Malaysian public?
Well, I think we tend to think that nature exists in nature, as in in the forest, somewhere outside of our cities and towns, right? So this rediscovery, I guess, suddenly would give us a sense that, hey, actually, there is still some discovery, some new things to find so close to our towns, within our cities actually, although it's in the park, right, and also, forested area, but still, it's just a few steps away from, potentially my house, where it's all concrete, and there is something to discover there, rediscover, something that obviously makes scientists like Dr. Faridah very excited, and her team very excited, but to the general public, it's also there's some treasure, hidden treasure, near my house, and I guess that gives us a sense of wonder and awe, and also some surprise, that hey, there's something out there to be discovered so close. And rather than thinking of our cities as just concrete and steel and barren of biodiversity, and of course that's completely not true. There's plenty of biodiversity even in our cities, and this rediscovery being so close to home really gives us that message. Yeah.
So would you say that this was, something that I suppose that you felt, the need to push a little bit more than say, because when we talk about wildlife in the urban context, I think a very big angle that, we usually see in the media is usually about wildlife and human conflict, right? People talk mostly about macaques, like, the monkeys are coming, and, people also tend to talk a lot in terms of how these species directly relate to human society. People talk about like, we don't have trees, so it's getting warm, But something like a firefly, right? It's one species of firefly that, for better or worse, people did not even know was there for about 100 years plus, right? So yeah, I guess from that angle, we talk about the wonderment and biodiversity in urban spaces. But what do you think that means for the average Malaysian, who is so used to thinking about wildlife in urban spaces from the context of like, how does this species serve me, or how does this species presence is detrimental to my being here?
I think for most people, we cannot make the connection between how this firefly, which I guess has been in Bukit Kera for a long time, just recently rediscovered, or more like correctly identified. So how does this firefly help me? Okay, say for example, I'm staying in Bukit Kera, or staying in Taman Tun. I've stayed here for decades. This firefly might have been there for decades, but my life have gone on perfectly well, apparently, without this recent knowledge. So how does this serve me in any way? Probably not. Probably the knowledge itself, this rediscovery, gives me no utility. It does not make my life easier. It does not make my electricity cheaper. It does not guarantee my water supply and things like that. But it does give us, hopefully, it does give us a sense of wonder, as you said, and perhaps hope that, this species has not gone extinct. For 100 years, we have only had 2 specimens, right? And in a place that is so developed now, specimens were, I think, originally collected in like Genting Sempau or something, which, of course, in 1912 or something, when it was collected, it was all forested. And now it's not, right? You look at the satellite. So maybe it no longer exists there, or only in very, very small pockets. But hey, it exists here, so close to home. So that might give us a sense of hope. Utility, I really don't think so. It'd be quite a stretch to put it, at least with what we know right now, right? But a sense of hope, a sense of perhaps even ownership of the area that we live in, the area that we occupy. I think if you ask the residents in and around Bukit Kera, do you feel responsible for what happens to Bukit Kera? I'm sure they say yes. And now with this newly identified resident, I think it's great, right? That gives us it should give us a new sense or stronger sense of ownership. Actually, now that I've said it, for the real estate agents out there, this might be a message that you can use to increase the real estate value of the residences there. Living next to a rare and the site, you'll be 50 steps away from the site of a scientific discovery. Okay, I guess there is some utility. Yeah.
I think it's quite. It's quite unusual, isn't it? Because the way you're describing, I suppose this indirect, I guess the correct term would be the non-economic valuation of this species rediscovery in Bukit Kera. It's almost as if, this insect might be the flagship for, I guess, conservation of that entire green, urban green space, right? And it's quite unusual, isn't it, Dr. Wan, for an insect to serve as, the mascot or, the spokesperson of conservation. Yeah, and I'm just wondering, in your career as a taxonomist, you've mainly worked with insects. You've also been quite eloquent. You've participated in quite a number of public communication opportunities. Yeah, maybe if you could talk to us a little bit about that, about how you've been able to make your audiences relate to you or relate to the topic of insects.
Yeah. I think, I like to pick up on the what
Yeah,
you
sure.
just talk about hope just now. So I think that's the keyword here. The rediscovery is actually give you some hope about the future of not just the firefly populations, but it's also future of insects and also wildlife out there, especially in a piece of land that is so demanding, like so high value. I think from educator point of view, it's actually raises hope about, because this discovery is not just by me, it's actually by my student who actually, go into meticulous way. Taxonomy is so demanding in terms of time and attention. So what he did was just to go through every single, specimen. And that is when he looked at it and he said, oh, I see some differences. I think we got a problem because this is unusual from the rest of the specimens that I looked at. So it actually gave me some hope, at least as an educator, that, hey, taxonomy is not dying yet. Our youngsters are still interested in doing this so-called routine, right? Ordinary work, just keeping notes on the observations. And then it gives me some hope that it actually sparks their curiosity. They just like, I want to know more. And then now even, my students are just like, not anymore like, they don't have prior knowledge about fireflies before. So they just like, let's go and chase fireflies and look at it, and the more species they want to learn is the more, excited they become and the more, their hunger for knowledge now.
Wow.
So that kind of, that's from my perspective as an educator. But as a perspective from the advocacy part, it's actually, you can use it now as a one selling point. Okay, maybe for the real estate developer, it's going to be something like, it's a good selling point about, we have a good condition of habitat. But from the advocacy part, it's actually give us, more points to actually, there is more reason for us to conserve this place. What if we have some more species? We are talking about rediscovery, but what if there's a new species? We don't even know Lamprigera. What species is that? It's probably new to science. Who knows? We don't even know many names of fireflies in Bukit Kira yet. We know up to the genus level. But from science point of view, I think it's a chance for us scientists to actually learn more about the species. Before this, we don't know what the habitat is. Now we know they are actually outside of mangrove compared to the other species of Pteroptyx. But they have chosen this habitat as their home, right? But what we don't know yet, how the larva look like, how the female of this species looks like, why do they choose high or tall trees? And what type of trees? Are they very particular about certain things? So this is actually give us more chance as a scientist to actually explore a bit more about the ecology, biology of this species.
It will also definitely help in the grant writing. And can we know the name of this promising student who gives us all this hope?
Oh, yes, Tan Wei Jack. Yeah.
Wei-Jack?
So
Okay.
Jack started as undergraduate when he joined my class, and then he expressed his interest into research, and then he said he would like to just be exposed more on research. So I said, okay, since I'm doing fireflies, so you got to work on fireflies, right? So from undergraduate, third year, final year project, which is only 3 months, and then he continued on honors degree for 1 year. And now looking forward to pursuing masters.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And he would be doing his master's on this rediscovered.
Yes, correct. Specifically on the life cycle, understanding life cycle of fireflies.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Something that I've experienced myself in the sort of science communication, biodiversity communication that I do is that, I always try to kind of push this message, right? That, and going back to the utilitarian, comment that we were talking about, to love a thing just because it's there. Because when it's not there, then it's too late, right? So if a thing is there, just appreciate it for what it is, right? But naturally, I think that tends to be quite challenging. I think particularly among a certain demographic, which most of my audiences are composed of. But it's very inspiring to hear from you that you're seeing actually a shift, I suppose, in attitudes, in enthusiasm among your students who would, I suppose, make up the upcoming generation of 19, 20, 21-year-olds. So that's great, Dr. Wan. I think that's amazing. So I recall that, when we were having some conversations about this leading up to the podcast, we did talk a little bit about accuracy. You mentioned that you're hesitant to make big comments about things until, as a scientist, this is 100% accurate, then I can say something about it. So I've got a question, I think, for both of you. Oftentimes when it comes to storytelling, when we want to inspire, when we want to instill a sense of wonderment, a sense of ownership, there might be a tendency among some storytellers to embellish. Right? We talked a bit about some of the posts that I've been seeing on social media lately claiming that we're the last generation. We are supposedly the last generation who will ever see fireflies. Right? And I suppose I understand where some of these authors might be coming from. It's from a place of like, we gotta light that fire under the public so that they are invested in, the conservation of these insects. But yeah, as a scientist and as a journalist, scientist turned journalist, like how do you go about, balancing that, that messaging? How do you go about balancing, the embellishment or, maybe the anthropomorphizing of, these species with, objective scientific fact?
Well, I think there's enough wonder in nature that doesn't require us, to impress anyone. And it doesn't require us to make up things or to embellish, or to exaggerate it beyond what is already real. For example, any species, right? Say even a fly, like when people talk about insects, once people know you're an entomologist or that you study insects, I mean, I'm strictly an insect ecologist, don't ask me to name any species name, I forgot most of them already. But once people know that you study insects, in Malaysia at least, what will be the first few questions that they ask you? Mm-hmm. I'm sure I can guess the first few questions that you get asked. Would it be like, how do you control mosquitoes? Mm-hmm. How do you control cockroaches? How can I get rid of flies? Yep. So it would be those questions. So it's always thinking of them as pests, right? And very little appreciation. They don't appreciate like cockroaches or flies. But in every of those species, there is wonderful and inspiring things about their biology or their ecology. Even like the flies in our toilet, for example, the latrine fly. We see it, we ignore it, we find them just disturbing. They're hanging around. While I'm doing my business. Or also in my apartment. Hopefully that doesn't say too much about my hygiene. But they come from the drains and stuff, and we think of them as pests. But actually, if you come to think about it, it's very impressive. Like just say something like that, right? Take an example. How are these insects so small, so simple, look apparently simple? When you flush the toilet, they don't get drowned. The flushing of the toilet doesn't drown them. They're able to fly out even though there's all this like water, what would seem to be like a whole waterfall of water gushing down on them. How do they do it? How do they not get wet? How do they not get pushed into the water by this force coming down? If you come to think about it, I can't do it. A human can't do that. Biologically, we are unable to do that. So I find that fascinating. And then once you start thinking about it, you don't have to say that, this is a latrine fly that comes in rainbow colors. No, they're just dull gray. But there are other things about them that makes them really interesting, right? Yeah. And so I would say that if a journalist or any scientist or any one of us who wants to make the public, anyone else feel awed by a species, let's take wildlife, a species, and if we have to resort to making things up or exaggerating something, then I would simply say that we have not done our research enough, our reporting enough to really find out what is so wonderful and great about this species. Once we have done that, and then we tap into our own experience of, wow, this insect really canggih. Wow, this one really amazing. What is it that is amazing? We tap into our own feelings, and then we just convey that to others. So I really say, if we do our reporting good enough, we don't have to make things up. That's for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think as a scientist, I think we are all trained to be, evidence-based. It must be evidence-based inquiries or activities that you do. So when we first, in this example of Pteroptyx gombakia, when we first thought that it could be this species, we don't straight away, just announce it. Although I did mention to FOBK, we might have another species add to the list, but we want more information first. So the first thing I said to my student, it's not like I don't trust you, but we need to double check. We need to verify the source. And are you sure it's not the sample that we collected from Genting? Because, Gombakia was from Genting. It was first originally described from Genting. And then my student said, no, it was in my notebook. This is the GPS coordinate, and then we go back. We actually went back to look for it.
Did you find it?
Yes. First time, no. We couldn't find it, and then we thought like, what if we missed the windows? Windows of observation. It could be like they are.
They only flash once a night the whole year.
or within the short window, like 30 minutes after sunset. So we were just like, okay, maybe next time we come again and then look for it. And we got lucky to got the specimen. And then I said to my student, this is how we do it. We verify the source. And then it's also not good to only rely on one specimen only, right? We need to understand why we get only one specimen, because Pteroptyx is known to be congregating, like number of individuals are actually congregating on trees. And then we start, having more and more questions, because that is also how I want to educate my students to actually think about more than just a specimen. Think of it as like in a bigger picture, like how do they live? How far do they actually can fly? They are really tiny, less than 5 centimeter. Sorry, less than 1 centimeter.
1 centimeter.
Sorry, less than 1 centimeter. It's actually really tiny. And then what you can see from far is only the tiny light, right? And then firefly is a beetle. So it's not as strong flyer as a fly.
Yeah.
So they have the shield, which is also make you a bit slower when they want to fly around the area. So that is something that you want to understand. So back to the evidence base. So this is something, and as a taxonomist, we always say that as a taxonomy, you have to be accountable. For any species that you describe, re-describe, we are very careful about the facts that we actually check. We have to see under microscope, look at the actual specimen and compare with the old specimen. And I even double check the specimen with the original describer, with Dr. Leslie Valentine. And because she relied exclusively on the museum specimen, which is already collected 100 years old. And then when you look at the fresh specimen, it's actually different. Different in terms of, how fresh is the color, how certain features are can be clearly seen and examined well. Yeah. So I think that is the point when I think as a scientist, and we don't try to, of course we want to make the headlines, but it's actually a good story from scientist point of view. It's actually a good point to actually say that, hey, now we have a chance to study in details about the features of this specimen and understand a bit more about the life cycle of this species, right? But of course, it's actually a nice story to also tell the public that, hey, fireflies in Kuala Selangor, like a Christmas tree, hey, this is actually the same group, but it's here.
Right.
Do they actually perform synchronous flashing? We don't know because we haven't seen them. But it's also point to the conservation point of view here. I would like to stress the fact that what if they are actually at the brink of extinction? What if this is the final, the final population that we are talking about?
The final last tree collected now in your bottles, in your vials.
Yeah, but I guess maybe that is the exaggerating part. Like, we don't want to go that, but it's good to actually keep in mind. Like, what if this is the last population that we are actually looking at? That's why we don't see them in multitude numbers of individuals. So it's actually also warrants you more time to actually to look for evidence of this species.
And I actually want to, maybe kind of expand a bit on that, right? So I think a lot of what we talked about, this might be the last population, we don't know, right? And obviously that kind of messaging, and I think in general, quite a number of messaging around conservation. I think recently Macaranga published something about the songbird trade in Malaysia as well, and when this message, so among the scientists in the room, we get, we are motivated by the facts. We're motivated by, I want to know more.
Yeah.
I want to know the life histories. I want to know all of these things, right? But when we talk to the public about it, there tends to be, I guess, whether conscious or not, an appeal to broader emotions. We want to get people to feel happy or sad, right? Perhaps, you could talk a little bit about how you feel about that, because I think this is where perhaps, the lines between factual reporting and, I guess what I termed earlier as embellishments might come into play a little bit, just not necessarily, inaccurate reporting, but, sometimes the words we use, the adjectives and
I think, well, as a scientist, I always go back to fact, right? Go back to the fact, but sometimes it can be misinterpreted in other ways, the way, like, how we want to sell the story, right? But telling story is always must be relatable. So you want the stories to be relatable to general audience. How do you want to tell the urgency of conserving these species? And we are actually not talking about just one species, particular species. In Bukit Kiara alone, we have 9 species of fireflies. And we use fireflies as actually symbolic. It's a symbolism of like, hey, this is maybe you call it also flagship species, because it's something that people value compared to flies, compared to other type of insects. It's actually what we call it emotive insects, right? Because it get people like sense of wonder, awe, and when you see firefly, you feel like, oh, so magical about how they produce lights, how they actually blink, glow in different color, green or yellowish. It gets so you get that emotion right into the heart of people. Then that's the message. You try to instill the message of like, hey, but we don't know how long they can be here. Like if we don't protect their habitat. For example, if you have like destroyed the habitats around Bukit Kiara, for example, just for the development, for the sake of development, you actually also destroying the firefly population. So I think the message must also accompanied by the fact that they are still here. But now the question is, we know now, for example, Pteroptyx gombakia, we know now that they exist. What can we do to protect them? So I think that is a question that we all are like in our own role. My role as a scientist, I would like to know more about the life history. But what you, as a resident of the Bukit Kiara, for example, or residents of urban parks in area near firefly population, what can we do? So that actually message that I think it should be conveyed, but also at the same time, every fact that we make must be also accurately determined and translated in a way that people can understand. Yeah.
Yao Hua, would you say that this is something that is challenging to juggle at all as a journalist, as a storyteller?
As a storyteller, and yes, definitely. So I guess you're asking, how do we balance between just talking about facts and also the emotional part of it. Challenging in the sense that the facts part is the reporting, and the emotion part is the storytelling. But I think we need to recognize that facts alone has no value in terms of informing or deciding on actions to take. For example, if I just say, last week there were 3 days out of 7 that temperatures were higher than 37 Celsius degree. That's a fact. 3 days out of 7 higher than 37 Celsius degrees. I can tell you that.
Yeah.
So, what does that mean? Should I act on it? Should I care? I now know the information, and I believe what you say is true. You show me all these like recordings. And so, then we have to put it into the larger context. And even to put in the larger context could still be just facts. But then we need to connect it to some sort of emotions that help people understand what this means, what's at stake for people and for us. And then whoever's listening, whoever's reading, will then decide if they should care and what they should do based on the feelings that we invoke in them or the description invokes in them. 3 days out of 7 were hotter than 37 Celsius degree. Well, if you like hot temperatures, if you are somebody who sells air conditioning, that might be great. You will say, oh, what should I do? I should immediately buy more ads on my social media platform because now I need to build on this momentum of hotter and hotter days. That's what you feel. You feel exciting. You feel excitement for your business. The actions that you take, increase the advertisement. But if you say in the same line, when we convey this, we say, 30 more construction workers were hospitalized because they had no choice but to be out in the sun, installing air conditioners for a new condominium. Then to the people who are reading this, they might feel sympathy, they might feel empathy, they might feel like, oh, how can, perhaps, they might feel, no, we cannot accept this. I cannot accept this, that I'm here comfortably in my room while there are people out there installing air conditioning, being hospitalized. Then they might take a different action, right? So we have to be really conscious of the fact that people would when we say, so many animals are dying, so many biodiversity is being lost even before we know about them, why does nobody take really, concrete action to solve all this? I always feel like either, when there is not the kind of response that we thought would be positive and solving the problem, it's usually down to two things. The first is that the people do not know. The people who can decide, they do not know the facts.
Yeah.
Right? The second is that they don't care. So if you give the facts, you solve the first one. You give them the information and you help them understand. So now they know. But just knowing that it's 3 days hotter, I still don't care, right? Then the caring part is where you build the emotion, where you trigger their feelings. Then they might care. I mean, you don't know. Everyone is different, right? You cannot invoke everyone to do the same thing. It's up to them. So we have to recognize that just giving facts is no matter how accurate the facts are, it's quite it really can't change much if it doesn't invoke or trigger any emotions in people. I'm not saying that we have to embellish or make things up. That's called novel, right? That's called fiction writing. But we just do the reporting enough, and then we think about it in terms of storytelling. There are always ways to deliver it very well.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting, perspective, to share, because I think when people think about scientific reporting, when people think about scientific communication, the assumption is that science, objective, factual, and not necessarily, are people mindful or aware of the aspects and elements of storytelling that goes into it as well, right? And I think that's a really fresh take, that facts on their own pretty much, not to hyperbole it, but pretty much meaningless, because people can take it any way they want, right? The example of the air conditioning company was spot on. But then coming back to the fireflies, right? And again with storytelling. So you mentioned fireflies, they glow, they are magical, and again that kind of evokes emotions. And then you brought up the latrine flies, which in contrast, they live in a smelly, dirty environment, and they're dull.
No, that's not my apartment. I have to clarify that.
But they're dull, right? You say they're not rainbow colored. I assume you're talking about the moth flies, the gray fluffy ones. But anyway, since fireflies, I want to say, inherently inspiring, inherently charismatic. Why do you think that there's been, so much challenge, getting people to know about them? Why are they not already the poster animal of conservation, the way that orangutans and hornbills and tapirs
I mean, if you ask all those people who love fireflies, we all say that fireflies are charismatic insects, because the way it actually attract people to really look at it, like, go out at night to enjoy the glow, the flickering lights and so on. But one thing for sure, if during daytime nobody cares about fireflies because they look dull, they just they are not as pretty as butterflies, for example. They don't really have colors, because that's not the purpose of them being, their purpose is actually being active at night. And during daytime, they just they won't move at all. And then if anyone spot, any beetle when they are walking in the park, they wouldn't notice that that's actually the firefly that they saw last night, for example. So that is actually, again, the challenge that I see is when you want to protect fireflies, people see them only at night. And then it's very hard to actually also tell them that, they are beetles, and they can be as boring as other beetles as well. And but they are important as any other pollinators like flies. Even, they have their own function in ecosystem. So I think the challenge is always how you want to make it like, every fact is worthwhile to discover, to actually make it known to public. But as I actually develop stories, try to get people's attention, and I realize some facts actually don't matter to actually inform. So you always get to focus on things that make people excited about it.
And what are some things that make, in your experience?
I think when they see fireflies are glowing and different kind of light, and then you start telling them like, hey, this is how they talk to each other, you know? And you know why light pollution is bad for them? Because it's as if you are in the dark room, someone comes in and shine the light on your eyes, directly to your eyes. What do you feel? It's actually you are blinded by the light. So that is how fireflies feel, or other wildlife, nocturnal wildlife at night. When you just use the light intensively or without any care about other wildlife that living in the same space with you. I think the understanding is that like using the fact that it's relatable to human, but at the same time, take one as a positive or interesting aspect of firefly, the rhythm, how they actually, it's like a Morse code. Actually, when they are talking to each other, they are giving out signals to each other. They communicate with each other. And then how wonderful it is, like every species has its own flash pattern. And how they actually, the color that they choose, and then the way they respond to each other, and the fact that fireflies, larvae, actually carnivorous, and they eat like snails, so that kind of like stories that make them, I would like to say, spark their curiosity, spark their interest, and then they were just asking you, oh, how do they produce light? Because they produce light. Is it not going to be like, how about like, heat or what, fire? Because, but then you said, no, they actually emit 100%, like almost 100%. Efficient light is just what we call it cold light. So it's much brighter than if you leave one firefly in the dark room, the entire room lit up just by one tiny firefly. That is how efficient the light that they produce.
I'm inspired. Okay, yeah. So I suppose, would I be right in, saying, and feel free to jump in as well, Yao Hua, that, as a scientist who is also an advocate for, conservation, it is quite important, I suppose, to identify what the entry point is for the general public, right? So, Dr. Wan, I'm sure you know 101 or a billion facts about fireflies that you could, speak to us for an entire week off, or speak to the public for an entire week on, but, you choose a specific angle to approach it in. And I think that's not too dissimilar from what journalists do as well, right? And any given issue has so many facets to it. But when you do that, right, so when you're an advocate for a species and then you're forced to kind of, I suppose, edit what goes out to the public, what, sort of responsibility or what sort of self-reflexivity do you need to also practice when you, decide, okay, I'm gonna focus on this one thing, even though there are 101 other things that, might be more, quote unquote, important. You mentioned fireflies are pollinators. I don't think many people know that.
Flies, not fireflies.
Ah, okay. Flies, not fireflies.
I was giving you an example just now.
Yeah, but I'm sure the other ecosystem services that fireflies, and generally that's what people think of, right? When we think of beneficial insects, right? We think of ecosystem services. Like I think that's why bees and the butterflies are so popular. Without butterflies, more food, and then right? But with fireflies, that's not really the case, right? You don't. They're not pollinators. Sorry, I misheard. But, that's not really the case. We don't talk about, the ecosystem services they perform, rather it's always about like, oh, look, light, they're like fairies. They're like, magical things. Yeah, so as their advocate, as the person who speaks on behalf of the fireflies, because, aside from you, I don't think anyone else in the room knows what the Morse code, the blinky blinky Morse code means. How do you, what sort of responsibility do you feel you have when you do something like this, you know? Yeah.
Well, first, as a trained taxonomist, is about accountability. You make sure the fact is correct, but what kind of fact that you want to sell to the public, right? But it's always about, when we talk about ecosystem service, fireflies actually contribute to stability in the ecosystem by looking at their life cycle. Every time I talk about fireflies, I always emphasize on the life cycle. When people get excited about fireflies, just give it an example of the one in that is subject to the firefly tourism, Pteroptyx tanner in Kuala Selangor. When people look at it, people just like, okay, let's protect the fireflies. Let's tanam pokok, tree planting, do for mangrove plants. But I think let's take one step back. What we are looking at, fireflies on the trees, is the last stage of the life cycle, of its life cycle. It's adult. But what we need to conserve is just the longest cycle of a firefly is actually during their larva stage. So what I like to emphasize is on the life cycle, how they actually have their own microhabitat they require at each stage. We look at the egg. When they lay eggs, they actually lay eggs on the soil, moist soil. It cannot be dry, cannot be too soft as well, but it's actually just good enough. And then if you think about fireflies in mangrove forests, which is subject to the intertidal zone, so there are times that because they cannot swim, the larva doesn't have gill, so you would expect that the larva shouldn't be in the water, right? So the larva should be somewhere not affected by the tidal. So how far do you have? You have to think about how far the larva, the adult firefly, after they mating, they have to fly back to the area not affected by tidal zone. And then that is when they spend most of the time after they emerge as a larva, they look for food. And we know they are carnivorous and they eat snails. And we are talking about mangrove, secondary forest, even in Bukit Kiara. So there are different kind of snails. What kind of snails are we talking about? So we are talking about not just saving fireflies alone. We are talking about other wildlife as well. We are talking about other population. We are talking about snails at the moment and other invertebrates that might be a prey for firefly. And then as we move on to the pupa stage, where they actually live in the chamber or they make their own, they protect themselves in the soil, and they need to be in an area where the area is covered, suitable enough for them before they emerge as adult. So the whole life cycle, and then we talk about predator and prey relationship, and they are all contribute to the stability. So fireflies, when you remove one part of them, you actually start to disturb the entire ecosystem. And we are talking about different kind of ecosystem at the moment. We are talking about mangrove. We can talk about in Bukit Kiara, for example, it's a secondary forest. We are talking about urban parks. We are talking about other terrestrial habitats and so on.
Is this what generally people mean when they talk about, some animals being indicator species, right? The understanding that because they have so many different requirements throughout their life cycle, the fact that they're there means that so many conditions need to have been met.
Yes.
Right. So in that sense, would you say that, it's quite surprising that some place as urban as Bukit Kiara has been able to tick, all of these boxes that, I think you mentioned there were 9.
Yeah, 9 species of fireflies.
Yeah, I think that's quite incredible. It's not generally what you would think would happen. I mean, Bukit Kiara is pretty much surrounded by cities, right? Or towns, I suppose you call it towns. How about yourself, Yao Hua, when you're doing, your reporting, for example, I don't want to go back to the fireflies, but for example, I think I read recently that, an entomologist in Singapore recently discovered or rediscovered a species of cockroach, right? To go back to the uncharismatic and the unloved.
Yeah.
As someone who co-founded a media outlet who, manages, what stories get out there, what is that process usually like? What species would you decide get spotlighted and why?
Well, at Macaranga, we don't really write on just species itself. We do issues more rather than we focus on one species, and our stories are typically 2,000 words and more, and usually a lot of reporting involved, so we tend to focus on issues itself. But regardless of whether it's an issue based or whether the entire story is about one species, last year we produced one of our longest stories on just one species, and that's a fish, arowana, the Asian arowana. Yeah. But we're not writing just about the fish itself, although that is a very charismatic fish, but rather on the conservation or the lack of conservation of wild Asian arowanas and how that would really inform our attitudes about protecting and managing our rivers and lakes, right? So there's a bigger issue there. Yeah. But of course, it's very complicated. Everything can be very complicated and complex. So how do we decide what to tell and how to tell? Well, At Macaranga, we typically choose topics that interest our editors. We are already suffering and working overtime for this, so might as well choose something that we like, to talk about. So that's one. The other thing is, but any topic can be made interesting, right? It's the hook that you draw people in. What is it in this issue or this story that would really relate to our targeted audience, and can bring them in. And one of the ultimate things is that there must be something that the message must be tied to some decisions or actions that your target audience can take or can make, right? If you tell them that the sun is rapidly cooling and will be, stone cold in 100 years, what can Malaysians do about the sun rapidly cooling down? Not much, right?
Yeah.
So, it's a very alarming story, and I just made that up, please. But then it's kind of like, so you tell that because it's alarming, very surprising, but then there's nothing they can do. So we want to tell stories where people can actually, make a change if they want to, or at least in their own behavior or in their own mindsets, right? So then in our reporting, we need to look for these things. We need to look for what is it that's really interesting about this issue? What would people relate to? We use that as the hook. And then once they are in the door, once they peek through the window, and then you draw them into this huge world inside this window, on the other side of the window, on the other side of the door. The journalist's role is really to collect the information, understand the information, analyze the information, and then put it all together, synthesize all these different pieces of information, and put them all together in a way that help our audience understand it, appreciate it, and then feel something about it, and then they can decide what they want to do about it. They decide on their own. What kind of future world do they want to live in? Maybe they want to live in a concrete and steel world. That's fine. That's their decision. Maybe somebody wants to live in a very forested jungle world where every step you take, you step on a beetle, and you'll be stung by mosquitoes 24/7. Maybe some people like that kind of world. Regardless. So it's up to them to decide. But we lay out the facts, we synthesize it, and then let them decide. So that's the challenging part for a journalist. I mean, for the scientists, one of their main output is the scientific papers, right? And in there, there's a certain format to write, right? And the audience, all the audience understand that format and understand that you don't have to invoke emotions. Although increasingly, some journalists are asking them to invoke emotions also, but practically you don't need to. Whereas for the journalist, I think it's a bit more complicated, the storytelling we have to do and the considerations to take. But ultimately, both scientists and journalists are getting information to our readers and helping them decide, do you agree with this? Do you like this? What can you do? Then go ahead and do it. Yeah.
Okay, so as we begin to wrap up, so we've spoken about, your communication, and we've also spoken about, professionally, how you identify your hooks, how you choose your angles to approach, how you communicate. I guess the next question, I want to bring it back to a bit more about your personal feelings about certain things, right? So we talk a bit about factual objectivity, we talk a bit about storytelling, but we've also, and I think Yao Hua, you just highlighted this, right? It's up to the readers, it's up to the audience at the end of the day, the potential for public apathy. Right, so when you are in that space as a human person who loves fireflies, who wants them to be around, and I suppose Yao Hua as well, as a journalist, with your own beliefs and your own positions on certain things, how do you balance that, your individual agendas with what goes out there, or do you not? Are you one of those people who are just like, what, this is how I feel, let's just go with it?
I don't know. I think it's more just when I work on fireflies, especially as fireflies, it's not about my job. So it's always about the passion. It's always about something that I think purpose of what I choose to be the purpose of my life. To conserve fireflies. One question that I keep asking myself is, as a taxonomist, I'm not just describing, naming, classifying fireflies, but it's actually what I want to do for their protection. Like the lease that I have, I want to make sure that I still keep it. The lease is not just like we don't have any more extinct species from our lease. So that is something that I think if you look at it from the individual point of view, I think actually my personal mission is that already being aligned with my career, career growth. So I think in that sense, I am glad that I had this opportunity. I have been given opportunity to explore my own personal mission together with my career at the moment. But compared to like 3 years ago, before I joined Monash, it was part of my part-time. It was just part of my hobby. It was just part of like side research that other than delivering your own work, it is part of me, asking around like, hey, will you help me to actually work together on fireflies? Let's gather some facts. In fact, the Luciola singapura, the one that I described from Singapore as new species to sign, it was just a collective effort. It was just like a group that has like, hey, do you have time? Let's go and explore. And then, you collaborate with the right people. What I would call it, people with a heart in the right place, because these are the people who will help you. So this is something that I think if I rely on just doing it for the purpose of my own mission, I think my personal mission is for fireflies.
So to really quickly like paraphrase that, you're basically saying that you're quite upfront about your personal passions and about your advocacy for the conservation of these fireflies.
Yes,
okay,
definitely.
A bit trickier for you, I think.
No, it's not trickier for me because I think both Juan and I are people who are very clear, or we understand very well why we do what we do. So for me, because of Macaranga and because I've always been writing about environment and nature and biology, people often think that, Yao Hua must be like a conservationist, he's an environmentalist. People always say I'm an environmentalist. But if environmentalist means that environment above all, then I'm definitely not an environmentalist. Yeah, so I'm of the sort that feel that respect is above all. Respect for what? So I've been a teacher for a long time. Even before I was a journalist, I've been a teacher. And I think the ultimate goal and why I really love teaching so much today, I'm still teaching, is that as teachers, we are able to help others realize their own potential and then respect themselves and respect everyone else, everything else. Respect is key. And so I also have the same approach or the same compass in my writing and in all my reporting. So I respect the developers who wish to build a new factory. I respect the government who have many things to juggle, many mouths to feed and many agendas to meet. I respect the conservationists who really care about wildlife. I respect the people who live there, who might want a new plantation there to get the jobs, but they also miss the forest or the wildlife that they had seen or heard when they were much younger. So I try to get people to respect all of these things, and in my reporting I do that too. So, but eventually, as journalists, what we present in the final form is, I would say, in my case, at most 30% of what we have reported, at most. And so we are filters, we are gatekeepers in a way. And for me, so to show that respect, to follow up on that respect, that compass of respecting ourselves and everyone, is to recognize the needs and desires of everyone, and then try to find a way that we can reach a situation where everyone benefits, right? Maybe, not maximum benefit for one party, but everyone benefits in a way with very little loss or no irreversible loss to any party. So, that's just a very long way of saying that we try to think of things as sustainable. We try to reach a way where things can be done sustainably in the long run rather than in the short run. And using that as a compass, I find that I don't have any moral struggles when I write about stories. I don't have any moral struggles when I look at what, say, a conservation group does and feel like, oh, this is a conservation group. They must be doing something great. They cannot do any wrong. I don't agree with that. Like, I think, oh, you guys are, sometimes conservationists might say things or do things that disrespect the other side. Yeah, so that's just how I do my work. And I think I really very much enjoy the work that I do. I mean, it's not a very rewarding job in terms of financially. Financially, it's not rewarding. But in all other ways, it is very rewarding. And so if you don't want to be a scientist, you can definitely consider being a journalist. If you are considering becoming a journalist, then maybe you can ignore the scientist path and stay on the journalist path. Kidding, but yes.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Wan and Yao Hua, for joining me today. The responses that you've shared, I think they've been very inspiring for me, coming from a place of passion, from a place of, respect. I really enjoyed that, and I think that's something that I need to be more mindful of myself, respect for all sides, respect for contesting voices, right? Even the ones that disagree with the general message that, we are advocating for.
Yeah.
Right. So thank you everyone for tuning in. That was Dr. Wan, Faridah, Akmal, Jusoh, and Law Yao Hua. And happy World Firefly Day.
You were listening to Future Conversations, a podcast by Monash University Malaysia. For more information, email mum.media@monash.edu.